Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski, and I'm a public services librarian here at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, also the co-coordinator for Random Review with fellow librarian Mike Hansen. Today, we're going to hear a review by Sarah Henderson of the book Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West, authored by Catherine Belton. But before I introduce Sarah, and she talks about this very interesting and timely book, I'd like to remind you of our upcoming random review on November 9th by Helen Cow of Lumina Hospice and Palliative Care, who will review Remember, the Science of Memory and Forgetting by Lisa Genova. This event will be held virtually, so please register at the link I'm about to share in the chat. You can also learn about and register for other upcoming random reviews, such as December's review of Anthony Doerr's latest, Cloud Cuckoo Land, by the local best-selling author Kate Hope Day. And let me get you that random review page link. Here it is. You can also watch past random reviews from the webpage that I just shared. For example, you won't want to miss the September random review of George Orwell's classic 1984, reviewed by award-winning best-selling local author of Whiskey When We're Dry, John Larison. A reminder that the random review series is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, which is an all-volunteer organization committed to supporting the library. We're really grateful to the Friends for their tremendous support. You can learn more about the Friends, become a member, and find out more about becoming a Friends volunteer at a link I will share in the chat shortly. Just give me a second. And there it is. I want to take a quick second to orient you to the platform we're using today. We're using Zoom, and to submit questions throughout the entire presentation that we'll answer at the end, please click on Q&A. It's usually in the top left corner of your window. Just a note that we're going to send a video recording of today's review via email to everyone who registered within approximately 24 to 48 hours. Recordings are also posted to our YouTube channel at the library, or the library's YouTube channel, that I'm going to share in the chat. Here it comes. Okay, let me take a minute just to tell you more about Sarah Henderson, our amazing reviewer for today. Sarah is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. She is the author of Building Democracy in Contemporary Russia, as well as Women and Politics in a Global World, in addition to articles and book chapters on various facets of the post-Soviet Russian political system. Sarah joined OSU in 2000 to do what she describes as her dream job, teaching political science classes at a university. One of the classes she teaches is on Russian politics. Her research interests revolve around Russia's democratic evolution after the implosion of the USSR. Sarah first visited the USSR when she was 6, when her parents, who were professors, drove her and her siblings around the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, as well as Poland and Hungary in a VW van the summer before she began first grade. Her senior year of high school in 1988, her parents moved her family to East Berlin. Sarah crossed the Berlin Wall every day to go to school and became interested in the larger dynamics of the Cold War. She enrolled in Russia in her first year of college, and the Berlin Wall fell that first term, sparking her interest in the trajectories of countries emerging out of Soviet-style communism. Subsequent study abroad experiences in 1992 and 1998 further cemented Sarah's interest, and she wrote her dissertation on the impact of foreign aid on Russia's democratization in the Yeltsin era. So I really can't think of someone more qualified to discuss Putin's People with us today. But of course, Sarah is not all work. She also enjoys playing the violin, reading mysteries and historical novels, and walking her dogs. She lives with her husband and 2 children here in Corvallis. Her kids are currently students at Linus Pauling Middle School and Corvallis High School. Sarah, could you please join us on screen?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie, for that lovely introduction.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I can't see, I'm normally, when I teach, I'm used to seeing all of my students' faces, and so I can't see everyone, but I know you're out there. So thank you, Bonnie, for having me. I've always seen the flyer since I moved here in 2000 for the random reviews and thought, oh, I wish the library would ask me to talk about something. So I'm both grateful and really excited to have this opportunity to talk about this book, Putin's People, which came out in 2020, so it's new, which I'd read about but hadn't gotten the chance really to go through myself. And I think it was particularly interesting to me because, as Bonnie said, a lot of the times I was in Russia kind of overlapped with the things that our author, Ms. Belton, was writing about. I was in St. Petersburg as a college student when apparently Putin was kind of building his career as deputy mayor, although at the time I had no idea of that. When I was doing a year of field work for my dissertation was when the Russian economy collapsed again in 1998, kind of starting this whole cycle of who's going to come after Yeltsin. I was doing research trips during Putin's first term of office and was in Russia when there was the terrorist attack on the Moscow theater, and also was in Russia when the Ukrainian presidential elections resulted in massive protests that came to later be known as the Orange Revolution, when Ukrainians doubted the results of that election, that the pro-Russian candidate had really won. But I also read the book with sadness. I teach Russian politics every year, and I normally look forward to it as an opportunity to analyze the trials and tribulations that not just Russia, but Russians have endured literally over the centuries, and the difficult process it's had since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so I was actually teaching the class when the war in Ukraine broke out, and a student said, "Hey, President Putin is addressing the nation," and we watched that address. And since then, it's sad to me to be reading this book because something that I used to love to teach, given how unhinged President Putin has really become over the past few years. It makes me sad to read this book, which is already a damning portrait of the Putin regime, and to see how much worse it's actually gotten since the book came out. But now I'm going to share the screen with you. I just put some slides together. So let's just give you a moment to make sure that you all see the slide. It's just a picture of the book. And I don't know how many of you have read the book, but as you can imagine, it's hard to keep up with what's literally a cottage industry of books that attempt to answer the question, who is Vladimir Putin and what does he want? On a whim, I went to Amazon and actually typed in the names of all of, I just have to move to the next slide. The names of all of Russia's post-Soviet presidents. And Vladimir Putin came up with over 2,000 hits in terms of books written about him. Then I thought I would check out Boris Yeltsin, since he was president for a decade. He only got 161 results. And then I was somewhat relieved to see that Gorbachev garnered over 2,000 results. So there still is more interest in kind of a president that took the Soviet Union in a pro-democratic direction than Vladimir Putin. And then as an afterthought, I was like, oh yes, wait, Dmitry Medvedev was president for 4 years from 2008 to 2012. He's this picture in the bottom right-hand corner here with Vladimir Putin, and there have only been something like 31 books. Or 33 results. So anyway, this is all by way of saying there are few leaders who've garnered so much curiosity, but also I think, and generated so many pages, but it's a president about which increasingly there's relatively limited information, and that in an increasingly authoritarian Russia, it's harder and harder to get people to talk about Putin or access records that can kind of be mined for analysis. And so if you just look at these pictures, I just sort of pulled pictures of there's Yeltsin, there's the handoff of power below of, sort of Yeltsin stepping back and announcing at the time prime minister, here's the tandem. And then this picture in the far right counter is sort of corner is kind of what the Putin administration has become. This is a picture of when Putin was meeting with sort of his Security Council announcing the invasion of Ukraine. And you can literally sort of see in that picture the highly personalized nature of what Russian politics are. Sorry, the slide just went back. So let's talk a little bit about Catherine Belton's book. It joins a really crowded field of Putin studies, but it really covers new ground by honing in more specifically on Putin's efforts in tandem with various elements of the KGB, as well as allies from his days working in St. Petersburg in the early 90s to reestablish control over the Russian economy after the disastrous decade of the 1990s. In part, this was, as Belton argues, was part of an effort to just continue to illegally siphon off billions of dollars in natural resource profits for the purpose of self-enrichment. But it was also, as she argues, a tool to wage the Putin regime's increasingly aggressive foreign policy agenda, which over time evolved to become the goals of weakening the West as part of the project to restore Russia as a great power. And so what I want to do in our brief time together is kind of accomplish three goals. One is to unpack this narrative of, to borrow the book's subtitle, how the KGB took back Russia and then took on the West. So I'll give a quick summary and flesh out the book in places to provide a little background. Two, what are the strengths? And I don't really like kind of the prism of weaknesses because it's an excellent book, but maybe I thought, what are some critical points that she doesn't discuss? Or also maybe what do we still need answers to, or maybe what would a political scientist kind of chime in with as opposed to a journalist? So that's kind of the second realm of things we want to talk about. And finally, we want to end hopefully with trajectories, or maybe update the book to recent events, particularly in light of Russia's unprovoked war that it has unleashed in Ukraine. What are some potential outcomes for the Putin regime? So first, what is this story that Belton wants to tell us about how the KGB took back Russia and then took on the West? She stretches this narrative over the course of 500 pages and 15 chapters divided into 3 parts and bookended by a prologue and epilogue. And so here, if you just look at these pictures, I just sort of chose, it opens up in the prologue, introducing us to one of Belton's main sources, an exiled oligarch, Sergei Pugachev, who was once deemed an insider in the Putin regime, seen as maybe someone who helped put Putin into power, later nicknamed Putin's banker, but then eventually fell afoul of the regime, fled to the UK, charging that the Putin regime had expropriated 12 billion of his own assets. But then he also fell afoul of the UK regime, and so then fled to France. So it's hard to kind of feel sorry for Pugachev. But nonetheless, his story, according to Belton's narrative, is really emblematic of Putin regime's larger approach to managing the economy. Expropriate, reappropriate, and use it as just another tool to help the regime achieve what it wants. And so if you just kind of look at this picture, it's just a picture drawn from, I can't remember which newspaper, but following the 2014 sanctions. But it just kind of gives you, whoops, my mouse keeps hitting over, change slide. It just gives you kind of a picture of who people speculate is kind of part of this new elite that Belton talks about. So let's talk about that part one. Part one sets the scene by going back to the 1990s and delving into Putin's transition from a lowly KGB officer working in Dresden in the final years of the Soviet Union to remaking himself into a politically useful aide to the mayor of Petersburg, at that time a kind of pro-democracy politician named Anatoly Sobchak, in the newly independent Russia. And as deputy mayor, Putin was responsible for overseeing the brand new world of foreign investment and privatization. It didn't happen only in Moscow, it happened all over the Soviet Union. And the book talks about how he wet his feet in the really murky waters of Russia's privatization process in the 1990s, before he was eventually offered a job in Moscow, where he moves when his boss fails to win re-election. And so then he kind of kicks around in various significant but behind the scenes administrative positions before being plucked, at least to the public, from obscurity to serve as Russia's latest prime minister in August of '99. And at the time, his appointment was met with kind of a yawn, since the economic crash of the previous year. Mr. Putin was the fourth in the space of 12 months to step into the prime minister's office. However, President Yeltsin shocks Russians on New Year's Eve of 2000 by resigning early, thus vaulting his prime minister, Vladimir President, into the job of acting president. And then he goes on to win outright the elections of 2000. And kind of taking us through this narrative, Belton shows just how chaotic and destructive the 1990s were. So if you look at the slide here, this is just the graph on the top is a picture of the size of the Russian GDP when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. You can see how that GDP kind of just declines disastrously throughout that decade. So for many Russians, it was a lost decade. They saw their standards of living plummet, their social safety nets completely kind of disintegrate into tatters. Men literally lost years off their life as life expectancy plummets from the stress of the 1990s. However, as Belton kind of shows us, she's really looking more at the fate of the elites. And so if you look at this picture down here, it tells us these are some of the new oligarchs. Here's a picture right here of the privatization check that all Russians got in order to try to participate in the 1990s economic transformation, which did not go well for them. And so what Belton focuses on in that narrative is the struggle in the late 90s for these rising few oligarchs to really kind of launch themselves not only into the economic heights of the economy, but the political heights. So while the KGB in the 1990s, a once powerful player, is temporarily sidelined from all the upheaval and uncertainty, there is a new group known as the oligarchs, a motley bunch. Here we have a couple of pictures. If I were actually to go back a slide, here are some of the most famous ones. There's Mikhail Friedman. Here I can see Vladimir Potanin, and the very edge there's Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who we're going to hear a lot more about. But what they shared, these new oligarchs, was a high tolerance for risk, because they set about making their fortunes, often by cashing in on Russia's massive privatization experiment. In the mid-1990s, they expanded their wealth through something that controversial known as the Loans for Shares program, in which in exchange for loaning money to the Kremlin to finance Yeltsin's re-election campaign, they received a percentage interest in some of the jewels of the Russian economy, kind of natural resource state-owned companies that hadn't been privatized yet. And this deal was set up basically under the assumption that the Russian government would default. Therefore, the oligarchs would get, for basically the price of their loan, a large percentage in these assets, which would generate millions, if not billions, of profits to come. So not only, though, did they expand their political wealth, they also, their economic wealth, they also expand their political wealth. In some sense, they basically bankrolled Yeltsin's second term as president. And so what they wanted as a result was political influence. So many oligarchs served in key, crucial cabinet positions despite their lack of experience. served as governors for cash-strapped regions, and were known unofficially as kind of the family, the group around Yeltsin that were decision makers, but accountable really to no one. And also because many of them owned media outlets in the wild world of the independent media in the 1990s, they also used their media outlets to shape public opinion. But the oligarchs' power was not completely assured. Yeltsin can only serve 2 terms as president. He barely won a victory in 1996. He's in poor health throughout the whole of that second term. The economy collapses in 1998 with the economic crash worldwide. Also, Russia defaults on all of its internal debt. Many Russians lost their savings. It is a perilous time if you're an oligarch wondering about what's going to happen when Yeltsin has to step down in 2000. And so if you look at these pictures here on the slide, this is just a picture of the Duma elections, the legislature in 1995. There are lots of different colors on there that each represent political parties. The only thing to really take away from this is thinking about the political climate in the late 1990s. There are all sorts of fragmented parties, making policy really difficult to pass. On the other hand, the largest chunks of color on these elections for both the upper and the lower house are reds and pinks. Those are the communists. They are still the largest organized force in Russian politics. Their campaign promise is to reverse the 1990s. So the oligarchs really care about who's going to follow Yeltsin. And so if you look at these various pictures, these are all sort of candidates for the next presidency who kind of auditioned as prime minister first. So you see Yeltsin kind of shaking. You can see he sacks one prime minister. He anoints Putin. These are pictures below here of other candidates that might follow Putin. Here's Yevgeny Primakov, who was kind of allied with the communists. Here's the mayor of Moscow. More broadly, it was kind of a really bruising world of competition with the oligarchs trying to decide which candidate do we want to support. And so the book, that first section, ends with candidates, the oligarchs deciding to line up behind this guy up here on the right, Vladimir Putin. That's him giving his New Year's speech when he's been vaulted from the prime ministership to the presidency when Yeltsin resigns. And in many ways, the oligarchs chose him because they thought he would be a convenient patsy. He was from St. Petersburg, so therefore he didn't really have any kind of what they saw as an independent power base in Moscow. So I think the original perception was that Putin would be somebody that would remain in the oligarchs' pocket and really kind of ensure that they would get to keep their assets. So part 2 of the book goes into the story of that first term, Putin's efforts to really break the power of these 1990s oligarchs. And as we'll see, not break the power of the oligarchs overall, but just replace them with a new set of oligarchs that he's chosen. So how does he do this? How does he break the power of the oligarchs? Well, he moves relatively quickly, in part because the oligarchs don't endear themselves to him. If you look on here, here's a picture on the upper left. Those are 2 oligarchs, Mikhail Friedman, or no, that's Vladimir Kaczynski, I think, and Boris Berezovsky, big power players under the Yeltsin era. Through the use of their media outlets. However, they start using their media outlets to criticize some of the earlier policy decisions of President Putin. President Putin moves quickly to squelch this, as Belton tells us. First, he uses what becomes his tried and true method of using laws selectively to quash opponents. So first, he quietly sends the tax police to these oligarchs and raids their office. The oligarchs don't get the message. They think they're untouchable. So they sort of continue their campaign of using the media to critique Putin until I think it's Kaczynski who's actually kind of arrested and taken in for questioning. So sort of scenting that they may not be able to stay in control of their vast fortunes, these early oligarchs that are pictured up on the left flee the country. And so other oligarchs see the writing on the wall and quickly kind of fall in behind Putin. But a lot of part two focuses on the fate of the biggest oligarch of them all in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is pictured in this big picture in the middle, at once the richest man in all of Russia. He had ridden the wave of kind of unscrupulous privatizations in the 1990s to build one of Russia's largest oil companies. And in fact, he was on the verge of cutting a big deal with, I think it was Exxon, in which to some extent, in Putin's eyes, kind of control of one of Russia's big power levers might pass out of Russia if Khodorkovsky was to go into business with Exxon. Also, Khodorkovsky was active in funding opposition political parties. He had talked about supporting the idea of turning Russia to a parliamentary system as opposed to one where the president was so powerful. And so Khodorkovsky, as the richest of all the oligarchs, perhaps thinking that he was untouchable, continues despite the use of warnings once again, the sending of tax police, the maybe arresting of underlings. And at some point, because Khodorkovsky ignores these warnings, Putin sends in the tax police to arrest him on a plane in Siberia. And the book really unpacks the story of how through a trial, Khodorkovsky was subsequently stripped of his multi-billion-dollar company, sent off to jail, and the story doesn't end there. Conveniently, he was convicted, among other things, of tax evasion. The valuation of how much Khodorkovsky owed in back taxes was exactly the same as how much Yukos oil was worth. And so the result of the trial was not only did Khodorkovsky go to prison, but that Yukos oil was going to have to be auctioned off. And mysteriously, when it was auctioned off, it was purchased by an unknown group called the Baikal Finance Group. Here are a picture at the bottom of two people nobody had seen before. Nobody had heard of this company. They made a bid on Yukos oil, and analysts were not surprised when several days later, this small shell company was in turn purchased by state gas company Rosneft, thus essentially returning Yukos oil from private hands back into the hands of the state. And so part two really kind of takes us into that destruction of the old elites. And part three then goes into the story of how this Putin, though, didn't just get rid of the old elites, rather he replaced the old elites with new elites, just in some ways building a new oligarch class that was more loyal, who owed their positions to Putin rather than vice versa, and who in many ways not only continued the extraction process from Russia's economy, but kind of blew it up to times 11. And so part three is really the story of how in many ways the big jewels, the natural resource kind of economy and companies really returned to the hands of the state to be used. And so she picks up this narrative. We look at these pictures. This picture just here is just an example of some of the Putin allies that over the years have been placed at the head of kind of very large state companies. This is a picture here. You go to the right, looks kind of confusing. Wait, there are all these colors, there are all these lines going everywhere. But what it sort of shows is how things have declined over the period of various Putin presidencies. And so this last part kind of charts the story of this red line, how the Russian state right, becomes much more active in the economy by representing a lot more of kind of Russia's GDP. And that's really matched by a decline in media, the independent judiciary, etc. So how does what world does she describe? So in this part 3, she describes a world in which the crony capitalism, in that sense, the sort of elite ransacking of the Russian economy makes the oligarchs of the 1990s look positively like angels. So part of part 3 really covers how the amount of money being built out of the Russian economy by these allies being placed in control simply triples, quadruples, raises to exponential levels. So part of what we learn about is how Russian money got laundered through the use of Kremlin-friendly Russian banks, making false loans to shell companies who in turn, right, kind of work through other shell companies that in turn send money to banks all over the world. The story itself is extremely complicated, but the end result is fairly simple. There's simply a lot of money from state-owned companies that isn't staying in Russia, but is rather leaving the country. And so if you look at these pictures in the middle, what she chronicles is really how these new elites use a lot of this money to enrich themselves and kind of enrich the Kremlin inner circle. So that top picture is something that's popularly known as Putin's Palace. It's a large house down along the Black Sea that was supposedly built by oligarchs, kind of using the slush fund. For Putin, I'm sure you've read the stories. If you go to this anti-corruption foundation, that picture on the lower right, that's Alexei Navalny, a key anti-corruption crusader. He released on YouTube a big expose of this Putin's palace. If you look at this picture, it's photos of supposedly the French estate of President Dmitry Medvedev. Here, in the water is a little house that was built for ducks. If you look at this picture here on the upper right, you can see how this one little detail was taken on by protesters within Russia as an emblem of the larger corruption in Russia. So plastic or inflatable yellow ducks became a popular item to wield at protests because it symbolized and referred to the duck house and Medvedev's property, which in turn symbolized the corruption. But part 3 isn't just about tracking the corruption and black money of the oligarchs who are now occupying key state positions. It also tracks how not only does it enrich the oligarchs, but this money is used to further Russia's foreign policy agenda. And so what we're looking at here, the middle picture, you can see that red line going up. That simply just shows how much Russia's GDP expanded under Putin. This is basically a reflection of high oil prices during this decade. And so in many ways, we might say that Russia always wanted to be viewed as a great power, but under Putin, because of rising oil prices, he actually has the finances in order to pursue his interests of being a great power. However, while the Yeltsin administration tried to emulate the West in order to restore Russia's power status, over the years, Putin increasingly takes on an anti-Western rhetoric in order to make Russia a great power. So this was symbolized in 2007 when Putin gives a very angry speech at the Council of Munich, which is kind of a national security sort of, all the heads of state get together, and he gave a sort of almost shoe-banging speech about how now the world is unipolar, the world is not safer as a result of that the United States is a dangerous and overly powerful country. Not only is it overly powerful, seeking to impose its will on others, it's also an incredibly hypocritical country. And so part 3 also goes into how the oligarchs are used and how this black money is used to, in many ways, fuel and act as a bellows on already existing cracks in Western society. So the book covers the expansion of funding and ties made with various populist and right-wing parties across Europe. That's what that chart on the left refers to. But he also goes into how the oligarchs, through their networks with buying houses in London and France, use those connections to, in many ways, taint Western institutions with the corruption of these elites. So by getting London banks and New York banks to house and store and perhaps unknowingly launder Russian money, Putin also makes, in some ways, the West complicit in Russia's corruption. And the final thing she covers is how this starts to also be wedded with a kind of very dangerous form of nationalism. And so this last picture looks at, it shows Putin with leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, but really represents this increasingly kind of conservative vision of what it means to be Russian. And the book chronicles how Putin makes alliances with kind of white Russian immigrants from the Russian Revolution to also really kind of spread this very conservative idea of Russian nationalism. And so she ends with kind of, where is Russia headed? She spends a chapter just exploring the links between the Trump administration and sort of shady Russian business people. Although, to be fair, even though this image shows all the links with current members of the administration, she's more interested in unpacking how Russians, even back in the 1990s, reached out to Mr. Trump, offering him improbably lucrative deals in order to license the Trump name, or also manage Trump properties that in the end never got built. And she doesn't really make any conclusions of this, but it's really kind of an example of how Russian money and connections are really sort of spreading around, in many ways, using people's and leaders' weakness against them. But she also ends up with an anecdote, a vignette from 2019, which is when local elections in Russia prompted many protests because many more Democratic candidates were struck off the ballot for reasons saying, oh, they didn't get enough signatures, or, oh, they didn't meet the qualifications. And so she ends on sort of a potentially kind of hopeful note, or wondering what, are these protests going to amount to anything? And, is it possible to break this kind of elite's hold on this grip on power, wondering if maybe cracks in the elite might somehow lead to political change. So let's kind of talk a little bit about maybe reactions to the book. And so I just have about 5 more minutes of comments, so there'll be time for questions. So what did I think about the book? So I really enjoyed the book. I'm a sucker for journalists' accounts. Here, if you look at these pictures, not just journalists' accounts, but also memoirs. So these are also some of my other favorite books that have been written about Russia, particularly in the post-Soviet era. I think what's great about them is journalists often have inner access to people that academics don't always have. But at the same time, I think by reading a journalist's account, what's very good about it is she had all these tantalizing details, like, did Putin potentially maybe work with terrorists in Germany when he was a spy? Was he tasked with handling them? There are all sorts of other insider details about the expropriation of Yukos oil. There's a even more kind of tantalizing and scary rumor that the terrorist attack on the Moscow theater was really kind of a Putin project that fell apart. At the same time, when you sort of read through all of the footnotes, a lot of these kind of charges are either it's a protected source, so you don't know who it is, or there isn't really a big paper trail kind of connecting us to, trying to figure out, is this valid? So rather than saying this is a bad thing, because I think that's in a way how journalism works, I just want to close on sort of maybe what are some additional interpretations, or what does Belton not look at? And so I think by having this binocular view of, really wanting to understand how the KGB and these inner elite kind of regain levers of control, when you look in binoculars, you're zooming in on something and not looking at other things. And so, what are things that Belton doesn't pay as much attention to, and what books do? So these 4 books that I'm going to talk about, I would read in addition to Belton or check out, because they kind of add more detail. So what is it that I think they add? Well, some of the things that I would add the book doesn't cover that I think are worth adding is that for a lot of us who read books about Putin, they can kind of sort of fall into what I call the Darth Putin genre, right? He's this kind of evil person who came to power with a plan. He makes all the decisions in Russia, right? And there are these minions that kind of implement it. But, there was this kind of linear plan, and this is where we are by now. I think a more complicated but less narratively simple approach is to look at the Putin regime and Putin as entities that have evolved over time. And this is something that maybe political scientists look more at, which is what's the logic and dynamics of authoritarian regimes? How do they evolve? And so other approaches, right? So Petrostate and Putinomics are 2 books written by academics, which rather than focusing just on how the elite kind of ransacked the state, they try to understand how the Putin regime, particularly in his first 2 terms, really tried to use state companies to, in some sense, right, kind of trickle down to the population. So for him, Petrostate, that book, it doesn't portray Putin so much as a crazed maniac, but more looking at how Putin started off as a statist. When he was in Petersburg, he wrote his PhD thesis on how Russia can use its natural resource wealth. When he was a prime minister, he published multiple articles about how can the Russian state use natural resources as almost national champions, right? These entities that are going to kind of try to represent and gain kind of Russia's economic and foreign policy goals. And so in this book, Goldman kind of puts this strategy in comparative perspective, right? That this is a strategy that lots of rulers use, right? How can we use state resources to achieve state goals? The Miller book also asks a really interesting puzzle, right? Which is, yes, the Putin model is designed to maintain power at home and expand influence abroad, but it was also designed to develop Russia's economy at home. Putin was no Mugabe of Zimbabwe or Maduro of Venezuela. For many years, a central tenet of the Kremlin was to prevent popular discontent, not by beating people up in the streets or invading other countries, but by guaranteeing low employment and adequate pensions. And so understanding the Kremlin to some extent was not understanding what was going on in the mind of one man, but really understanding the dynamics of various groups of people jockeying for power. And so what the book doesn't go into, Belton, is that while there are these oligarchs exploiting the economy, there's this whole other arm of the Kremlin at work. Here we're talking about just bureaucrats known as technocrats, right? People with econ degrees trying to design rational taxation policy, passing the privatization of land legislation,
keeping interest rate policy sound. So to me, an interesting story is, even though in some ways Belton is correct, right? We've ended up with a system in which Putin is reliant on a small group of elite. An equally interesting story is, how did Putin get there? Because he actually didn't start off there. And so how did, in some ways, these technocrats get marginalized? And so these two books here, All the Kremlin's Men, Mikhail Zygar is a Russian journalist. He actually was the founder of Dozhd, or Rain TV. It was a famous independent television station, which eventually all the owners had to flee the country, and now he's living abroad. But it's a Russian take, and Russian journalist take tends to echo the West, but maybe be written with a little bit of a more sophisticated analysis. He has insider connections to a different group of people than Belton. Another interesting book, I think, is Between Two Fires. Joshua Yaffa writes for the New Yorker, does a lot of their Russian analyses. And he's interested in, again, not sort of these evil masterminds, but all of these people that are lower down that have to make compromises, to live and advance in the Putin regime. So that's just kind of my closing thoughts, that I highly enjoyed the book. I would highly recommend it. I would also use it as a jumping point to read other accounts of the Putin regime. But also, how does the system end? I think given Ukraine's recent advancements on the battlefield, we've seen an enormous amount of speculation about Putin's grasp on power, right? Like, is he going to be overthrown? Are his elites going to desert him? Are we thinking about regime change? I can tell you what a political scientist would say, that since 1945, most regimes don't collapse to then be followed by democratic elections. That only happens about 1/4 of the time. Rather, either new elites take charge, right? Just a new group within the old group. So I think Venezuela here, Maduro just follows Cesar Chavez and drives Venezuela deeper into the ground. Or an entirely new elite replaces the old one. Think Iran after the fall of the Shah. So there was no democratic transition after the Shah's regime collapses in 1979. Rather, there's just a new, more repressive regime that follows. So as toxic as the old system has become, not only for Russians, but now for the world, it has developed its own logic. And so I just want to end thinking also about Belton's ending. Remove Putin, you still have more believers waiting in the wings. Take Putin out of the equation, and to borrow from Belton's title, you still have Putin's people in power. That's it. Okay, thank you, everyone. Oh, good. Okay. I was so worried about getting done in under an hour.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. You gave me a lot to think about, and something it made me think about too, just all these like kind of different perspectives or different accounts. Just how much like the historical record depends on these different perspectives, or how much it's influenced by these different perspectives. So it'll be interesting, like years and years later, like how we describe these events. So,
well, especially since, what's so hard is, I don't know for all of you if you sort of remember the days of the Soviet Union, but it feels like the old style of like Kremlin watching, where you're trying to make speculations based on, Putin was holding on to the table strangely, do you think this means he has cancer? But it just goes to show is right now, still, there are not enough elites to have defected that will then kind of talk to anyone, that we really have a sense of what's going on, so.
Yeah, it's both like really scary and fascinating at the same time to me. So we do have some questions And please, everyone, submit your questions. We'd love to hear from you. I have a few questions from Daniel. They all kind of relate to what the book does and doesn't mention. So I'll throw a few out. And the first one, does the book mention the Syrian civil war, Russian involvement, and the Syrian refugee crisis, and the weaponization of refugees to destabilize the EU?
No, it does not. So it's really finally focused on this kind of retransition of power from the old oligarchs to the new oligarchs, and in terms of looking at how Russia pursues its goals in terms of foreign policy, the book really focuses on maybe kind of Ukraine and sort of the early days of Ukraine, and I can't remember if it does Crimea, but no, it doesn't look at Russia moving into the Middle East. So it's a narrower slice.
Gotcha. Thanks. He also asked, does the book mention the FSB use of social media to influence U.S. elections?
No. So, surprisingly, there's no chapter on, kind of U.S. presidential elections or something like that. So I think as a financial reporter, what she really focuses more on is kind of the infiltration of the oligarchs into really kind of Western financial institutions. And so in that sense, her book kind of fingers the West too a little bit. She's like, Putin took advantage of the fact, of the West consumerism and greed by kind of implicating the Bank of New York and all sorts of London banks and helping to launder money. So she doesn't look as much at ways to divide politically. She's more interested in kind of ways to use the Russian economy to infiltrate and impact Western financial institutions.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then Daniel also asked, does the book mention the FSB involvement in the 2014 invasion of Crimea?
That's hard. I would have to actually kind of relook at my notes. Yes, I think it does. It does go into that somewhat, but the book in that sense, I guess I would say, if you are really interested in financial reporting, then it's the book for you. But it's a book more about the levers of kind of the change in economic policies and the way the new oligarchs work, and less about kind of how it is truly impacted the Russian economy or other economies. So the most that she goes into more on Ukraine is looking at the ways in which Russian elites tried to kind of corrupt Ukrainian leaders by giving advantageous gas deals. So again, Daniel, I think the larger thing is when I talked about it being a binocular book, it doesn't make it a bad book, but it's really wanting to focus on these economic tools.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions at the moment, but I'd like to maybe leave it open for another few seconds, see if anybody else wants to chime in with a question or comment.
Yeah, and also y'all are more than welcome to send me an email if you have questions. So Daniel, just thinking about your question, I'm trying to think of like what are books, that cover that more. And I can't think of any off the top of my head. So that's why I say send me an email and then I'll do a little bit of searching if sometimes it's hard to wade through all the different books. I've really been enjoying Timothy Snyder's writing, mostly because I'm a Russia person. I'm not a Ukraine person. And Tim Snyder is he's a historian of Ukraine. And so his writing on Russia is more from the Ukrainian perspective and Russian foreign policy. And so it's really interesting to kind of get that lens on it. So I would recommend almost anything by Tim Snyder.
Thank you. That's a good tip. And yeah. I love how you called it the genre of Darth Darth Putin
Yeah.
books. I think publishers should use that as a genre definer. That's really
Although,
funny.
I used to sort of make fun of it, but of course it's almost, I mean, it feels so true. I just remember I was teaching class Russian politics. My student, we were sort of building up to the Ukraine war, and I was sort of saying, like, no, it's completely irrational for Russia to invade Ukraine. I just think it's a, game of brinksmanship. And then a student said, turn on the TV, or actually the computer. Putin's speaking to the nation. And after we watched the talk, like, he did sound like Darth Putin, in the sense he's certainly become Darth Putin. And I say that in the sense of any of y'all who have kind of listened to Putin's speeches or read any of them. They really, sound almost unhinged. And this is kind of heartbreaking for me, because so much of my teaching has been about sort of trying to be like, well, what, kind of what's the Russian narrative of, how do they tell their story of the 1990s and the 2000s? And it sounds, and it might be a very different narrative than kind of the way we tell it in the West. And so that was never a justification for Putin, but it was always like, well, like, what's, why is he so upset? And, the horrible thing about this war, besides the huge damage it's doing, not just to Ukrainians, but to the world, is just, it's completely delegitimized that whole Russian point of view. I can't, he's crossed such a line that I don't even know how I'm going to teach anymore. It's like, what's the Russian narrative? I don't know.
That's so difficult. While you were
Yeah.
talking, we actually got a few more questions, if it's okay.
Yeah.
They're kind of big ones. We'll see if we can get through them or not. But Carol asks, Nord Stream sabotage, is there an internal logic there for Putin to have ordered it?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that question, Carol. I think I had that in my little notes that I wrote, and at some point, because I wanted to be done on time, I just stopped looking at my notes. So I think that's a great question that you're asking, because, right, it doesn't seem logical for Russia to potentially sabotage its own oil pipes. Neither of them are working. But I think, Carol, what that points to is, if it is Russia sabotaging its own pipes, and some people argue that yes, it is, because Russia also kind of mysteriously cut off the gas pipes to Germany, saying there was like a technical glitch. And I think the bigger significance of this is a huge change for Russia, actually. Since the 1970s, the Soviet Union has built a reputation of it is a reliable supplier of natural resources to Europe. No matter what's happening politically, it will keep the gas pipelines running. So, Carol, what I think is so significant about this is it just shows what a break Putin is making with previous policies that was maintained, by his own administration for decades, right? You don't use natural gas and oil as political weapons. So it's huge that this is happening, and people are saying it's just further evidence that, he's really kind of gone off the rails in terms of Russian nationalism at any cost.
Thank you for that perspective. A question from Greg: how does this author's take on Putin compare to that of Fiona Hill?
So I would also recommend The Many Faces of Vladimir Putin. And Fiona Hill, for those of you who know, also for the Trump administration for a while, she was kind of his national security advisor on Russia before. She'd served multiple presidential elections, Republican and president, and eventually she left, and then wrote a memoir about that called There's Nothing There. How I think they differ is, Fiona Hill is more interested in kind of the politics side. So this is really a book about the Russian economy. So it differs in that it looks at politics, but also the book, The Many Faces of Vladimir Putin. I think Fiona Hill kind of offers a little bit more of either I don't want to say more sophisticated, but she's more interested in seeing Putin as kind of multiple people, kind of shaped by multiple interest groups. But I would recommend Fiona Hill's book. I would just read lots of different books. I think it's always good to get multiple takes on Putin.
Great, thank you. It is 1 o'clock, but since we have 2 more questions, I'll just throw out one more if that's okay, and then we'll wrap it up. And Cheryl asked, to what extent do you feel that the US and NATO are involved in the situation we find ourselves in now? And is there anyone, any country doing any kind of job to push diplomacy?
Right. So for those of you who are kind of interested in so there's a whole, originally there was a whole big debate about, in some ways, the kind of the West push Putin to this point by expanding NATO, particularly under the Bush administration. And I can't remember who joined under the Obama administration. And if you're interested in that, you can Google John Mearsheimer, who is a political scientist who presents that point of view. I actually think certainly one observation I would make is that Russia has never been as powerful as it wants to be perceived. And there has always been an asymmetry where the West's national security interests are always more important than Russia's national security interests. And so I think that's true. I don't think it justifies the invasion. But every time I read memoirs, people are like, yeah, Russia was really upset, but it was like more important, to achieve this outcome. So I think it's part of it, but I think it's so much bigger. I think Putin has now used NATO. It's kind of like sometimes when we have a relationship that falls apart, there are many reasons why it falls apart, but we tend to focus on this one event, right? Which becomes the symbol of why everything fell apart. And I think in some ways, NATO has become that for Russia. And at some point, Putin never got interested in any other narrative that might make Russia feel more secure. So I think he sort of also clung to his resentment about NATO in ways that just became hugely unhealthy. When I think about who is in charge making these decisions, I just can't imagine the Bush administration and the people advising Bush making a different decision. So maybe in retrospect, I don't know. Members of Eastern Europe wouldn't say it was a bad idea. I'm sure they're super glad for NATO expansion. So I still put the blame more on Putin. He's chosen to make it an issue.
Great. This has all been so wonderful, Sarah. Great job.
Sure.
Really thorough review, really interesting. I love the kind of comparison you did across, because there are so many books about Putin. It was really interesting to hear your take on all the different books that are out there and how this one kind of compared. So it was very interesting. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Today.
Well, thank all of y'all. And then of course, again, always feel free to email if I didn't get around to your question or you think of one, because I always love to talk with people about their interests in Russia. So thank you for thinking of me and inviting me. And I guess I'll say goodbye.
Yeah, we'll sign off. Thank you, everyone.
Right. Bye,
Have
everyone.
a great day. I hope we see you next month. Take care.